Okay, well, I will assume that means a no, so that there are no questions related to homework number 4. So make sure you send that to me by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Like I said, my kind of goal tomorrow is to get it graded and back to you over the lunch hour so that we can go over it tomorrow afternoon so that you all have feedback on it before we talk about the exam tomorrow or on Thursday. So anyway, exam number 2 is on Thursday morning. We will talk more about that. One of the things I forgot to kind of solicit feedback from each of you on is the process by which we conducted the exam, meaning me sending you a file at 9 a.m., it being in Word, you kind of taking pictures and, including that in the file and sending it back to me. If any of you have any insight or advice about how the logistics of the exam might be run better, particularly from your side. Sometimes it's hard to tell from my side how things went. But if there's something that you think would be better or could work better, I'm happy to hear it. So if you can, if you think of something that you'd like me to consider for the exam, I'm happy to think about it. So send me an email. Or you can talk to me now, but was somebody saying something? Logan?
Yeah, I thought about that. Because it takes a while for us to take pictures and stuff, could you maybe have the due date like 12:15 so that we could kind of get the pictures in? Because I had to do it at like 11:45 last time to get all the pictures and email them, get them into a good size for my document.
Yeah, I can consider that. We can probably do that.
Sounds good.
Okay. Good suggestion. Let me think about it, but I think we can probably do that. Okay, so if you think about anything else from the exam, like I said, send me an email. I'm never really have conducted exams this way. Well, I guess that's not right. I guess last spring I did this a little bit, but that was kind of like in the heat of the moment. And so if anybody has any ideas about how this could be run better, I'm happy to learn. So, okay, what are we doing this afternoon? I've promised I'm not going to take more than an hour of your time. So what I want to talk about this afternoon is really stabilization policy, particularly stabilization policy during the 2008 financial crisis, and a discussion of stabilization during the 2008 financial crisis will then kind of lead us into thinking about where we are today in terms of thinking about stabilization policy and other questions that macroeconomists are considering. And so this discussion is not only important for exam number 2, but like I said, these are some of the questions that I'm going to ask you to write about in your macro paper. Right, your macro paper is really to do some analysis on an article from The Economist magazine that is questioning how macroeconomic theory has changed in light of the COVID crisis, right? And what are some of the areas of research that economists are considering towards, creating new thinking about the way that the economy works. And so I think a lot of what we talk about this afternoon is kind of good background information. Some of it talked about in the Economist article, and some of it not really talked about in the Economist article, but things that will give you good background so that you can, so that you'll kind of have that to rely upon as you think about providing your own analysis in that macro paper. So we left off this morning talking about monetary policy and stabilization policy. Okay. Hold on one moment. Okay. So let's talk about what exactly did the Fed do during the global financial crisis. So as we mentioned right at the end of class this morning, the Fed quickly drove interest rates to zero. This is the liquidity trap, right? This is the liquidity trap. And the liquidity trap is that once interest rates get to zero, traditional monetary policy, kind of like what's captured in our short run macro model, traditional monetary policy really reaches a limit, right? It really reaches a limit as to what it can do to stimulate the economy. And so very quickly, I think the Fed realized that once interest rates get to zero, the Fed is going to have to try some different things, right? It's going to have to try some different things to try to stimulate the economy. And so I want to talk about three things that the Fed tried, and I think with some modicum of success, not perfect success, but some modicum of success. The first thing is the Fed tried to reduce the risk premium, F bar, right, that we talked about this morning. And they did this by trying to increase market liquidity through purchasing assets. As we talked about this morning, liquidity disappeared in many markets because everybody wanted to sell and nobody wanted to buy. And so what that did is that increased the risk premium, that increased F, and that increased interest rates sky high. So if nobody wants to buy, who out there can buy? The Fed. And that's exactly what the Fed did. The Fed jumped in, they bought MBS, meaning mortgage-backed securities, right? All of those bonds that were securitized to mortgages. They bought other collateralized assets. So there were also bonds that were securitized to corporate debt. There's bonds that were securitized to consumer debt. The Fed jumped in and bought a lot of these kind of assets. And the idea was to increase liquidity and try to reduce that risk premium, right? Try to get interest rates back down and try to make markets move again. It's easier to reduce liquidity risk and serve as a lender of last resort for the entire market than it was for every single institution, right? By that, I mean, the Fed very quickly realized it could not go out there and bail out every struggling institution. That was just a logistical nightmare. So what they needed to do is, instead of supporting individual institutions, they needed to support the market. And how are they going to do that? By buying. Just as an aside, this worked out wonderfully for the Fed, right? Because the Fed was able to do, the old maxim in markets, buy low and sell high, right? So the Fed really was able to buy a lot of this stuff at dirt cheap prices during the crisis, because they're the only people that had the liquidity. And so not only was this good economic policy, but it actually made taxpayers a lot of money, although that was not obviously the objective. The Fed also tried to put downward pressure on long-term interest rates through purchasing treasury bonds. So typically we think about the Fed managing short-term interest rates through the federal funds rate. But the Fed also tried to drive down other interest rates in the economy, like long-term interest rates, by purchasing treasury bonds. And treasury bonds are long-term bonds as opposed to treasury bills, which are short-term bonds. This was the program called quantitative easing. And quantitative easing, a lot of people talked about quantitative easing as if it was some radically new thing. No, instead of buying T-bills, the Fed bought T-bonds. Instead of trying to control short-term interest rates, the Fed tried to push down long-term interest rates. So, it was just a twist on what the Fed has typically done. I guess the big difference here is the Fed did this in a big way, right? And we're going to see this in a minute, how aggressively the Fed pursued this. Well, actually, let's talk about it right now. This is looking at the Fed's balance sheet, okay? So you see the assets that the Fed bought, and then these are the liabilities. And the biggest liability is the Fed just creates the money supply. Remember, currency plus reserves is the monetary base. So the monetary base is the Fed's key liability, and then their assets here are the things that the Fed bought. So notice that in May of 2007, before the crisis, the Fed had about $906 billion of assets and about $906 billion of liabilities. Look what they did to the balance sheet between May 2007 and March 2019. The Fed has essentially quadrupled the size of their balance sheet. Most of that change within the period of 2008 to 2010. So the Fed dramatically increased the monetary base, in other words, the money supply. And what did they do? They bought US Treasuries and they bought a ton of mortgage-backed securities. So it's good to be the Fed, right? I mean, no other institution could have, quadrupled the size of their balance sheet in such a radical way in such a short period of time. But that's why it's nice to be a central bank, right? You can essentially create all the liabilities you want by just simply printing money. And so what the Fed did is they printed a lot of money and they bought assets in, support of trying to create more market stability and reduce that risk premium. The third thing, actually, here's just another way of looking at what the Fed did to the balance sheet. This is just another visualization of it. You can see how they dramatically increased the size of the balance sheet, with almost all of the increase coming in mortgage-backed securities and long-term treasuries, right? That was the main things that the Fed bought. The final thing that the Fed did is they followed a practice called forward guidance. Forward guidance is a fancy sounding word. Some people often call this cheap talk. And all that forward guidance means is that the Fed basically announced to the public what their policy was going to be for a long period of time. So typically when the Fed announces policy, they say, well, this is what our policy is going to be for the next 6 weeks. And they might give hints to what they're looking at past that, but they're never going to be very, very specific about what they're going to do other than over the next 6 weeks. So in a big change of pace, the Fed changed that and said, we're going to tell you what we're doing over the next 18 months. We are going to keep interest rates at 0. And so what the Fed really tried to do is they tried to announce to the public that they were going to permanently, or not permanently, but for a long period of time, keep interest rates down to 0. In essence, trying to reduce the expected inflation rate. And so here you can see the blue line is the actual federal funds rate. And then the yellow line is what the market expected to happen to the federal funds rate over time. When the Fed did this forward guidance in 2012, you can see that almost all of these lines got flatter, meaning that the public immediately expected lower inflation and lower interest rates as a result of the Fed's announcement, okay? So that's what the Fed was trying to do. They were essentially trying to influence future interest rates simply by talking, right? Simply by trying to persuade and change people's expectations. And it worked, in part because what does the Fed have? The Fed has transparency and credibility. That's what we talked about yesterday. So central banks can actually change interest rates not by doing things, but just talking about doing things if markets find them credible. And I think this is a good piece of evidence that markets actually do find the Fed credible, right? When the Fed says they're going to do something, they're going to do something. So that was monetary policy, right? How does this fit into where we are today? Well, I'll just say very briefly that many of these things are the things that the Fed is trying to do to fight COVID today. All right, the Fed immediately conducted a big asset purchase program in March in an effort to try to stabilize financial markets, just like they did back in 2008. The Fed has tried to provide forward guidance to markets by talking very carefully about what they plan to do over the next year or 18 months. So the Fed has been doing that. The Fed has been trying, so basically the Fed is trying to follow the same playbook in many ways, right? Realizing that it's a different crisis, but trying to do these 3 things. It is important to note, though, that this remains a challenge for the Federal Reserve. Interest rates were low before COVID, and interest rates are essentially 0 again. And so that reduces a lot of power of monetary policy, right? Monetary policy is limited in a world where interest rates can go to 0. And so one of the things that your article that you're to write about talks about is alternatives. Like, what do you do in a world of, what are central banks supposed to do in a world of 0 interest rates? Some of the things that are talked about is, can a central bank set interest rates negative, right? So should central banks be trying to set interest rates negative? What does that mean? What are the dangers of that, right? One of the dangers is you're going to encourage financial disintermediation, right? You're not going to encourage people to save their money in the financial system if they're getting a negative return on their money. But that also really encourages people to spend, right? So these are some of the alternative policies that the Fed is considering now. And as I said in the Economist article that you're to read about, they talk a little bit about some of these, right? And so I think our discussion here hopefully gives you a little bit of context to think about that. What about fiscal policy after the 2008 crisis? I'm going to skip this, right? Fiscal policy. Well, when people think about fiscal stimulus, they think about the Obama stimulus package, right? A package of fiscal stimulus that was passed right after Obama was inaugurated in 2009. So this stimulus was about $787 billion. Of that, about $250 billion was in tax cuts, and about $500 billion was in government spending. Most of that government spending, though, interestingly enough, didn't take place until 2010. So a lot of this government spending was on infrastructure, like building roads, building bridges, making some long-term investments, which in some sense makes a lot of sense. But there was a problem with it: long legs. In other words, you don't just say, well, here's some money to build a bridge, start it tomorrow, right? I mean, that's not how things work. You have to set out bids, you have to plan it. If it's a bigger project like a road, you have to go through all sorts of legal challenges and planning and zoning. And I mean, these projects don't just happen at a snap of a finger. And so while there was a big increase in government spending, it didn't really kick in until more towards 2010. And so that was a big problem with the fiscal stimulus, is not that government spending can't stimulate aggregate demand, because it can. The problem was it just took a while. And so that's one of the reasons why, if you look at figure 11.6 here, these are estimates of what unemployment was, and then the dots are what actual unemployment was. And notice how basically the government, the Congressional Budget Office, consistently predicted that unemployment would fall faster than it actually did, right? Once again, our forecasts weren't particularly good in the aftermath of this crisis. We expected the economy to recover a lot more quickly than it did, particularly in the labor market. The labor market was very, very slow to recover, and that was surprising. Part of it was because a lot of that fiscal stimulus that was supposed to help the economy immediately really didn't start helping the economy till 2010, 2011, 2012. But we know, as we talked about yesterday, this is just also a problem with forecasting, right? There's so much uncertainty associated with these kind of forecasts. And it's very clear that economists really didn't fully anticipate how long it would take the labor market to recover from the mess that happened during the global financial crisis. The other big fiscal stimulus was the bank bailout and TARP, right? Remember, TARP was the Treasury Asset Relief Program. So this was a $700 billion package to purchase capital in banks. So one of the mistaken beliefs about TARP is that somehow the government was just giving banks money. Just gave them money, never had to repay it. That is not what happened with TARP. TARP was essentially investing in banks. The Fed became an owner of banks by purchasing equity. Why? Why would we want the government to be purchasing equity? Because it has everything to do with leverage, right? It has everything to do with leverage. If you just gave banks loans and they use those loans to increase their assets, that's going to increase leverage. It's going to make banks more risky, because remember what leverage is: assets divided by equity. So if you just gave banks money to go buy assets, it's only going to make them riskier. How do you reduce leverage? By increasing their equity. And that is essentially what the TARP did. The Federal Reserve, or the federal government, basically made all of the major banks sell shares to the US government in an effort to reduce leverage. This was a $700 billion package, but in the end, how much did this end up costing? Almost nothing. Because once again, the government did not lend money to banks, and banks did not default on that money. The government ended up buying equity in which the banks eventually repaid them. And in fact, the government made a pretty nice profit on this. So, this is one of the areas where I think politics really got in the way of understanding the simple economics of what was happening. Economists now see TARP as one of the real big public policy successes of the last 50 years. TARP was, from an economic perspective, undoubtedly an economic success, and it actually proves the value in understanding economics. There's a story. I think it's true, but if you remember, the global financial crisis was taking place during the election of 2008. So this is when George Bush was president, and John McCain was running for president, and Barack Obama was running for president. And there's a story that Ben Bernanke, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, had to sit down and write the leverage formula on a napkin for the U.S. Treasury Secretary, right, of the Bush administration, and explain to him why TARP had to take place by increasing leverage and not just giving these banks a loan, right? So in other words, even the Treasury Secretary of the United States didn't fully understand the idea of leverage, which is shocking in one sense, but in another sense, it goes to show you that, there's a lot of fundamental misunderstanding about economics. But when people do understand economics, it gives real powerful insight. And so the success of TARP, I think, speaks to the power of economic insight. But it also speaks to the power of politics. That in many ways, this was an economic success, but it was a political disaster, because many people just kept on talking about, well, you have these banks and they misbehaved, and then the government gives them a lot of money. Doesn't that turn your stomach? And yeah, it does, right? Particularly when a lot of these bank executives then took big bonuses and said, thank you very much. I mean, politically, it was a disaster because of the ways that these banks behaved. But economically, it was a success. So Timothy Geithner, the Treasury of the Secretary under Barack Obama, he said, very famously, we saved the economy, but we lost the public. And I think that's very much true about what happened in TARP. TARP saved the economy, but politically it was a disaster because this never really got explained to the public. They never really quite understood what was going on. And so if you today just ask most people, was TARP a good thing or bad thing? Vast majority of the public will say it's a bad thing. And if you ask them why, they'll say, well, because we just gave all this money to banks. We just gave it away, right? Which is not what happened. But yet that's the perception. And in many ways, perception is reality when it comes to these kind of economic policies. And so, the pros of this kind of bailout was that we got the money back, and it did reduce panic, right? Once these banks got a big infusion of equity, they were a lot less likely to fail. But of course, the problem is moral hazard, right? And by moral hazard, I think you all know what I mean by that if you reward bad behavior, you're going to get more bad behavior. And so many people didn't like the bailout because they saw it as rewarding banks. And if you reward banks, given all the bad things that they did and the stupid decisions they made, what are you going to get in the future? You're going to get more bad decisions, and you're going to get more corruption, right? So, the fiscal policy remains very, very controversial, right? And unfortunately, when it comes to the use of fiscal policy, particularly nowadays, this largely breaks down along partisan lines, where liberals or Democrats tend to be big fans of aggressive fiscal policy, and conservatives tend to say, oh no, we hate it. Why? Because of moral hazard or because of worries about debt. So tomorrow we're going to talk more about fiscal policy. This is the focus of chapter 18. What we're going to talk about more tomorrow. But I'll say, just as a preview, there's a lot of rethinking going on about fiscal policy among economists, right? And some of this rethinking is once again talked about in the Economist article that you have to write about, where economists traditionally have been very worried about the dangers of debt. But increasingly, economists are really wondering, why are we so worried about debt? Particularly in a world of zero interest rates. In a world of zero interest rates, when you can borrow for free, why should governments be so worried about it? Right? And so we'll talk about this. So while, economically or politically, there's this big distinction or big argument between liberals and conservatives, I think in many ways economists have kind of fundamentally are in the process of fundamentally rethinking what are the dangers of debt, and should we be as worried about that as we are? And maybe we should be conducting more fiscal policy as opposed to less. So, we'll kind of get into this tomorrow. Another part of the follow-up to 2008, and I'm just going to skim through this very quickly because this is a bit ancillary to our class. But for those of you, particularly who took money and banking with me, you might remember that one of the big outcomes of the financial crisis was the Frank-Dodd Financial Reform Act, in which how the U.S. financial system has been regulated has been significantly reformed. And this include many things. I just kind of focus on a couple of them. Now, the Federal Reserve is the systematic regulator, right? By that means the Federal Reserve now is the primary regulator of the financial system. So the Fed doesn't just manage monetary policy, they also regulate banks. And so that's a big expansion in the role that the Federal Reserve plays in the US economy. In the future, banks are not going to be able to give bailouts in the same way that they did in 2008. In the future, if a bank gets a bailout, they can get a bailout, but it also means they're going to have to go into organized bankruptcy. So what organized bankruptcy means is you don't close your doors today, but you close your doors gradually over time. You basically unwind the bank. And so while this hasn't been tested out yet, this is a fundamental change from the past, where instead of bailing out banks, we're not going to do that. I mean, banks can get a bailout, but only at the cost of going out of business. And so part of the reason for this change is to try to reduce that moral hazard incentive, right? Try to reduce the idea that banks can just do whatever they want and get bailed out. Also, I want to talk here about larger capital requirements. Banks have been forced to hold a lot more equity than they were before in 2008. Who's hated this? Banks. Banks hate this. Why? Because it makes them less profitable, because they have lower leverage. So if you've been following bank stocks since 2008, you'll see that bank stocks have not performed particularly well, in part because banks are less profitable than they were. However, what's the argument? The argument is that with lower leverage, banks are going to be less vulnerable to failing. And in fact, we have seen that during the COVID crisis, right? One of the things that economists were really worried about back in March is, would we see another system of bank failures? We haven't. And largely, we haven't seen a system of bank failures because if you actually look at where banks were in March, banks were in a much safer position in March of this year than they were back in 2007. Banks are lower leveraged and hold much more capital. And as a result, they were much better primed to survive an economic downturn. And in fact, that's what we've observed, right? That banks have actually, held up pretty well. And so that's great. Now, how long will this hold on, right? As this COVID crisis moves into the second year, there is the danger that more and more banks are going to find themselves in real problems, right? Particularly as more and more households find themselves in real problems. As households get in problems, they're going to start defaulting on their student loans and their credit cards and their mortgage debt. And so, I don't want to talk like banks are out of the woods, But I do think that we see the value of asking banks to hold more capital, is that banks are safer, at least before this crisis. Banks were a lot safer in 2020 than they were in 2007, and that's a good thing, right? They're a lot less profitable too, right? As you might know, if you play around the stock market, hopefully you haven't been holding a bunch of bank stocks. Okay, one last thing here before I let you go. I just want to talk about one other big phenomenon that's happening in the US economy. And this is something else that shows up again in this Economist article that you are asked to write about. And that is this idea that there is some evidence that potential output in the US has fallen. In other words, we are growing slower than we did before, in the 1990s. That the rate of trend economic growth in the US has fallen. So to put this in terms that of our model, Y bar has gone down. Y bar has gone down. And I want to talk about, first off, why this might have happened, and then maybe leave it up to you to kind of think through some of the ramifications of this. But let's talk about why this has happened. Economists have spent a lot of time thinking about this. This is one of, quite honestly, the big research questions out there in economics. Why has output growth fallen? One reason that has been suggested is this idea of what's called secular stagnation. And the idea is basically that we're just not creating the same number of new ideas that we were, right? Why? Maybe it's diminishing marginal returns. Maybe diminishing marginal returns to ideas has really kicked in. Maybe the ideas that we're developing just aren't very good ideas, right? Some people, you might call them, technology critics. I don't know if that's the right way of saying about it, but some people say, look at the great new technologies that we're developing. PlayStation 5, right? Well, fantastic, right? But does that really increase productivity? Right? a lot of innovation is more for entertainment, but is it really making us more productive, right? In some ways, some of this stuff might be making us less productive, right? Because we spend more time messing around with this entertainment stuff and less on actually putting it to productive uses. And so, the idea is you can kind of see this, right? The fall in interest rates and investment, that would be a symptom of just lower productivity growth, right? This less investment demand is because we're just not creating any new ideas. If you look at total factor productivity, once again, you can see that total factor productivity growth has declined. So in this figure here, 1411, this is looking at total factor productivity in manufacturing, which is the green line, and then the private sector, which is the blue line. Notice here how both of them have trended down, but particularly in manufacturing, right? That productivity in manufacturing has really, really leveled off. And in fact, it's even gotten negative, or not negative, but well, yeah, actually, I'm sorry, that's right. The total factor productivity in manufacturing is actually fallen. If you look at the growth rates, once again, you can see here the growth rate of total factor productivity. This is A, right, from the Solow model. If you remember this is growth accounting. This has really fallen down. Do we know why exactly? Well, we don't know why, because remember, how do we calculate total factor productivity? We calculate it as a residual, right? It's what's left over. It's what we don't understand in many ways. So we see the decline in total factor productivity, but we don't really know why. Maybe it's because we're producing less ideas, maybe we're not. I will say that there are some other guesses or some other ideas about why total productivity has fallen. And let's talk about these. One is, we know it's not, or we can be pretty sure that it's not government policy. Why? Because we're observing the same thing across different countries. So it doesn't appear to be necessarily something that's idiosyncratic to the US, right? It doesn't appear to be something related to US policy. I guess we can't necessarily rule that out, but I think the fact that this is happening across many countries is something to think about. And so what could be causing it? Well, one hypothesis is it's just a reflection of demographics in the US. We have an aging population. We are having lower birth rates. We are having slowdown in educational attainment, right? One of the things we know about the COVID crisis is that it has reduced the number of people going to college. That's not good in the long run, right? That's not good in the long run. We might add to this, I should add to this, less immigration. There's good reason to think that immigration to the US increases productivity. But yet what's happened here over the last 4 years particularly is that we've had a pretty significant reduction in immigration into the US. And so we just have an older population, right? We just have an older population, and there's a real worry that that might be why we have fewer ideas, is because we know that who creates the most ideas? Well, it's young people, right? You tend to create more ideas when you're young than when you're old. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be productive when you're old. When you're old, there's other forms of ideas that you can create through things like experience and know-how. But there is a lot of evidence that suggests that people are, particularly in terms of creative ideas, much more creative when they're young. And so, yeah, and many economists have, without getting into the details of the data, have found some evidence that suggests that this aging population is part of the reason for the total factor productivity decline. If I can show you just one piece of evidence here. Can you see this? The graph that says old age dependency ratio. So this is looking at the dependency ratio in the United States. What's the dependency ratio? It's the number of people who are retired divided per 100 workers. Okay, let me say that again. The number of retirees per 100 workers. So if you notice in 1960, there were about 15 retirees per 100 workers. As we go out here toward the year 2050, we're talking about more than 35 retirees per 100 workers, right? So that is a lot of people that are not going to be in the labor force. And if we apply the Romer model to that, that means that they're part of the population, but they're not in the labor force. They're not creating new ideas. And so this is an effective reduction in our labor force over time. And this could certainly, if you find the Romer model persuasive, which I do, this certainly appears to be one of the reasons why we've become less productive, is we are creating less ideas because we have fewer people working, right? We really have an effective reduction in our labor force. The second, or another reason why this has been suggested, the productivity slowdown, has to do with, once again, this move from manufacturing to a service-based economy. What's the thing about services? They tend to be more labor intensive. And what's the thing about being labor intensive? It's harder to increase productivity in jobs that are labor intensive because of diminishing marginal returns, right? So, think about a service such as providing a college education, right? Like what I do as a college professor. What's the ultimate limit in how productive I can be? The fact is that I am just a human, right? I can only talk so fast, think so fast, type so fast, communicate so fast, right? You can give me a faster computer. I guess you can, put me on Zoom so I can have more students. There's certain things you can do to increase my productivity, but ultimately I'm limited by the fact that I'm a human. And so many services, there's really a question about what are their limits in terms of increasing productivity? How productive can a college professor be? How productive can a yoga professor be? Or a yoga instructor be? How productive can a healthcare worker be? Given that ultimately these jobs are tied to humans, right? So, that's one argument. I don't find this one quite as persuasive. And part of the reason I don't find this quite as persuasive is if you do look at the data, let me show you here. This is actually looking at the price index of higher education and healthcare. Actually, now that I say this, this is actually a piece of evidence in support of this. But notice how much more expensive higher education and healthcare are getting relative to things like food services and vehicles and clothing and household durables, right? The fact that these services are getting so much more expensive might be a reflection that our productivity is not going up very fast. And I think that's true, right? That part of the reason we're moving to a service-based economy is that we've actually gotten pretty good at making physical things. And so as a result, we've gotten so good at them that their price falls, and we end up spending a bigger fraction of our income on services, right? So just to give you an example, in the old days, people would spend half of their income on food. But now we've gotten so productive at making food that its price has fallen. And now we spend less than 10% of our income on food. What has that done? That's freed us up to spend more on services. But of course, services are more expensive because it's harder for us to increase the productivity of those things. So in other words, productivity is falling simply because of the nature of how we're developing. The final reason why we might see falling productivity, and this one is also talked about in the Economist article that you're to write about, is inequality. There is more and more evidence that part of the reason why productivity is falling in the US is that we have this growing inequality. And what does growing inequality mean? That some of the people who are the best and brightest we're not able as a society to take full advantage of their skills because some people have access to things like a high quality education while other people do not have access to a high quality education, regardless of their skills. So, there's data that suggests that more inequality reduces educational attainment. In other words, more inequality means that fewer people go to college, which makes sense. There's also a lot of evidence that inequality has reduced intergenerational mobility. And by this, I mean the chance that a poor person who has skills becomes rich, and vice versa, the chance that a rich person who doesn't have skills becomes poor. Right? So this is actually falling in the United States. Let me just show you a little piece of evidence about this, or just a graph or two. So look at this. This is looking at college attendance versus parent income. So this is for kids born between 1984 and 1987. So not to give too much of, so what would this be for people that are basically in their mid to late 30s today, right? So this is looking at the correlation between whether you went to college, right? What percent went to college and how rich your parents are. And look at the strong correlation, right? The correlation or the slope is about 75%, 0.75. So in other words, the relationship between how rich your parents are and whether you went to college is extremely strong, right? And we see this again and again and again. that what is the best predictor of how rich you will be and what your education attainment is? It's how rich your parents were and what their educational attainment is. That's not good, because we know that there's not a perfect correlation between parents and children, right? We know that, for instance, things like IQ are not nearly that highly correlated. So this suggests that, kids that have high skills, but that come from poor parents, are actually not getting the kind of education that they need. Here's another way to think about this. This is looking at intergenerational mobility and income inequality. So this is here looking across countries, looking at the correlation between a kid's income and a parent's income. So on the vertical axis, we have the level of inequality in the country, measured by the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a complicated measure, but basically, the higher the Gini coefficient is, the more unequal a country is. And then on the horizontal axis, we have what's the correlation between a kid's income and a parent's income. And what do we see? Countries that are more unequal have lower intergenerational. Wait, let me back this up. Sorry, I'm explaining this wrong. On the horizontal axis, we have intergenerational elasticity, meaning the correlation between a kid's income and a parent's income. So if this goes up, that means that there's less intergenerational mobility, right? Because if a kid's income is more closely correlated with a parent's income, it means that it's less likely that a poor kid will become rich or a rich kid will become poor. So what do we see? The countries that have the most inequality also have the highest correlation between parent income and kid income. And you can see where the US here is fairly high up on this scale. And unfortunately, we look a lot like countries that you don't think of as very equal, right? Brazil, Chile, China, Peru, Singapore, Pakistan. Nobody's ever pointed to these countries and say, wow, those are really egalitarian countries in which poor people can become rich, right? I mean, it's a sad fact that the US among rich countries is one of the most unequal countries among rich countries. And so this idea that many of us have as Americans is like, well, we're America. This is where poor people become rich, and where you work hard, you can get ahead. Unfortunately, if you look at the data, you just don't see that. And so there is some evidence that this lack of equality is directly reducing our productivity. So this is one of the big research questions in economics is productivity falling? And if it is, why? And how do we understand it better? And what impact does that have, should that have on our macroeconomic thinking, and what impact should it have on macro policy? So this is one of the questions that, is as I keep on saying, is talked about in that Economist article, and they're out there for you to think about. And so, I wanted to talk about these things not only because they're relevant to understanding macroeconomics in the short run model, but I think that if this is all useful to you, is giving you some kind of background information so that you can better understand that Economist article and hopefully write a better paper, all right, which is what I'd like to see from all of you. So on that, I think we've basically reached the limit of how much I can talk today and how much you can listen. So anybody have any questions before I let you go? So remember, homework number 4 is due tomorrow morning. If questions come up, you can send me an email. I'll be checking my email tonight, okay? All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.